Welcome to Head Games, the science and psychology of sports. I'm Dr. Brett Levine, joined as always by Dr. Ben Rosenberg. Ben, did you watch the NBA draft last night?
I watched the first 3 picks, then I had to teach a class. Honestly, I was very depressed about Klay Thompson possibly rupturing his Achilles.
That was no bueno. Yeah.
Did you watch?
Found out right before the draft that like something went down, and it was just sort of like, oh man.
Yeah.
I watched a little bit of it. I thought it was entertaining. I mostly wanted to make sure that pick I made and put out on the interwebs was accurate, and it was good. LaMelo Ball went to the Charlotte Bobcats, which is great. I think we should talk about the draft at a later time. Today, we're covering one of my favorite topics, which is fantasy sports, and in particular, fantasy football. We have a wonderful guest with us today. Dr. Renee Miller is a neuroscientist, director of undergraduate neuroscience program at the University of Rochester. When she's not in professor mode, she's writing about psychology and fantasy sports for The Athletic. No big deal. She won the Fantasy Sports Writer Association Award for Best Fantasy Football Series in 2019. Dr. Miller, welcome to Head Games.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Of all the sports things I've done, this is the first time I'm doing it with 2 other PhDs. So
there you go. There's a first time for everything, right?
We're not that impressive. University professor in upstate New York, teaching psychology, writing about psychology and fantasy sports. Tell us, what does living the dream feel like?
Feels pretty great. I mean, I always loved science. I always loved sports. I was kind of happily pursuing these parallel paths until I was teaching a class about cognitive biases and all this crossover. I think it was December, so it was probably like fantasy football playoff time. And all this crossover started happening in my brain. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm making so many mistakes. I'm like supposed to be an expert on decision making and how the brain works. And I'm doing all these things wrong. So if I am, probably lots of other people are too. So that's when I started writing. And although my research is still very behavioral genetics, not related to cognitive bias or sports at all, it's become quite a big part of my life now.
Yeah, that's great. So how did the Athletic thing come about? I mean, that's no small deal, right? The Athletic is one of the most well-regarded sports writing websites and spaces out there. Yeah.
So like a lot of people, I've moved around a lot, started writing for some smaller sites, some sites I still respect a lot. One of them is RotoViz. Mm-hmm. They've developed a lot of really data-driven tools to help people help themselves, which is great. They're a great group of sports experts and brilliant coders. I worked for ESPN for a while in baseball and football. I still write for Rotoworld, their daily fantasy basketball and football. And then The Athletic called. I had a relationship with one of the editors there. I had done a show on the Fantasy Sports Network in Toronto for him. And so when he got this position running the fantasy division at The Athletic, he called, and it was a good fit for me. Certainly, I love what they do. Their approach is, I think, top notch. Not that I'm biased. I love their stuff, right?
Speaking of cognitive biases.
And the way they tell those stories is just really compelling, I think. I've spent a lot of time reading.
Yeah, they have some really interesting pieces. And this sort of leads us to our next question, because you wrote recently an article for them. And I mean, I don't want to just randomly plug The Athletic, but I think, as you said, they have really excellent content. And I've been lucky enough to get a free subscription through T-Mobile or something this year. And now it's like, I'm never gonna give this up, right? Because it's only like $1 a month or something to actually get the content. And it's really excellent. It's like my go-to source now. So you wrote an article recently for The Athletic about fantasy football trade deadline. People's trade deadlines are approaching. So given that the window to make these trades is closing very, very quickly, can you give us 3 names that you're targeting in trades and maybe just a quick reason why?
Sure. Well, maybe not. So personal, right? Trading is so personal. It only depends on what you need and what the person that you can trade with can give up, or maybe what he or she needs. So it's hard to say, oh, everyone should go out and get, I don't know, Nick Chubb or Kirk Cousins or Herbert or whoever might be a desirable ad. You know, I have Russell Wilson on a lot of my fantasy teams, and I think Justin Herbert, minus the new haircut, is great, but I don't need him. Like, I'm not going to go get him, but somebody else might really try to target that. So it's very hard to give some names. I threw some names out there. I based my article on partially strength of schedule going forward. There are still a couple teams that haven't had their bye yet. So I'm not looking for anyone, Carolina, Tampa Bay are still a couple weeks out from having their bye. I want somebody that's past that has a good strength of schedule coming up and that fills some need on my team. The other strategy that I like for trading is and this applies more for teams that are sort of coasting in that first or second place spot and are really set, is try to find that potential hidden gem or diamond in the rough, somebody that I think, Jacoby Myers is becoming probably a little late on that, but maybe like a J.K. Dobbins could have a really strong end of season. So somebody that could be a real difference maker might be worth trading for, that the team that has them is maybe they need something to win now and this person is just sitting on their bench. I like the idea of, seeking out and trying to pluck those players that, could make a big difference in week 15.
Right. So the idea is basically like there's teams out there that need wins now. And if I have assets that can help them, I'm going to give you those, but then I'm going to make longer term investments. And if I'm sitting at the top, I don't need to win right now. And so it's sort of a win-win. Diving a little bit more, I think maybe into your research in biases, more broadly, what's your strategy with fantasy football trades? And is there any like psychological jujitsu that owners can use to consistently win trades?
So trades are all about attachment, I think. And I'm sure you guys know about the endowment effect, where we tend to feel more attached to things that we've invested in. And we value them higher than somebody who hasn't made that same investment would. It comes up in stock trading a lot. It comes up even in, your personal possessions around your house that you just don't want to part with, this sort of mundane thing that has no real value at the garage sale. But to you, it's got all these memories associated with it. And we do the same thing with our fantasy football players. We tend to overvalue those players that have been with us and that have helped us win week 7 and that had the dramatic comeback on Monday Night Football in week 9. And so we tend to overvalue, and that makes it hard to trade. So I think I try to find a balance between fantasy football is fun and I want to have some emotional investment and I want to care about my players and love it and relish in it, but I also want to treat it a little bit like a business transaction and not get too emotionally attached to the point where I can't make realistic deals. Because with trading, it has to work for both people. Like, there's nothing worse when you get the article like, how about if you give me Dalvin Cook and I'll give you Mike Williams? Like,
right.
Thanks, but as much as I need a wide receiver, that's not a good deal.
Yeah. One trend I've noticed is that a lot of times you'll get an offer for a trade. It's like, here, take these like 4 mediocre to crappy guys I have for your one stud. And it's like somehow there's some, as Brett said, psychological jujitsu going on there where the owner offering the trade is like, maybe because I'm giving you all of these assets for your one dude, maybe you'll make the trade. And like, I do not fall prey to those, but I can see how that would be potentially tempting for people.
Yeah, it definitely is tempting for people. And that win now team might really need those mediocre players to fill some gaps. And I don't know, Antonio Gibson and Jonathan Swift might equal a Dalvin Cook if you really need 2 startable running backs. So they do have appeal, but you have to balance your needs with the other team's needs. And is it really working well for both of you?
Yeah. And another interesting thing that I've noticed, I think that's related to a lot of this, is I end up with some of the same guys on my team year after year after year, right? So for a while, I had Frank Gore on every team. And usually I'm in like, let's call it 3 to 5 leagues every year, right? So I'd have Frank Gore on every team for some reason. And this was like when he was good and on the Niners to now when he's like 39 and still somehow in the league, which is very commendable. And then more recently, I've had Devontae, forgetting his name, Adams, thank you, on every team, which turns out to be fantastic, right? He's like wide receiver number 1. But is there anything to that? Like, why do we end up having the same guys on our teams year after year?
Yeah, so that could have something to do with endowment effect also. I find that a lot of people, I mean, when you play in multiple leagues too, you want to, partly for practical reasons of like keeping straight who you're rooting for each week, but also to have that kind of consistency where you're not rooting for the guy in one league and against him in the other because you're facing him. So I think when we play in multiple leagues, we try to do that. I don't do that. I do the opposite, which is novelty bias, which is always trying to get something new and different. So I'll actually go out of my way when I'm drafting to be like, all right, I already have this player on. He's there, he's available to me at whatever my pick is, but I'm going to not take him and get something different.
I wonder if that's a winning strategy, because if you're in 3 to 5 leagues, you pick the same guys in every league, you're really not diversifying yourself. But if this novelty bias is like, well, if I spread myself out, I'm guaranteeing, or, hopefully guaranteeing that like maybe one of those, teams does well, probably one doesn't.
Right.
But I like that.
You're somehow spreading the randomness of the injuries and all the other stuff that happens, which probably is the winning approach. I mean, I tend to do pretty well, but probably is not the best approach to have the same guys stacked on every team.
Yeah, I think it depends whether they're the first round players or the 8th round players.
Right.
So like one player that I came away with in almost every draft this year was Sterling Shepard in like round 10 or 11. And it hasn't been great, right? It's not, but it's not making or breaking my season in any of those leagues. So I think there's less risk with doing that if it's not Christian McCaffrey every league, right?
Yeah, that would be a rough one for this year, to be sure. Although perhaps everybody could have expected some regression given his ridiculous productivity and over usage, but I don't know. Those things are hard to predict, obviously, too. So staying on the theme of cognitive biases, obviously you've written a lot about these and done a lot of work. And the sort of definition that we use, I think, for bias is a shortcut that our brain uses to kind of make decision-making easier and more seamless, right? So obviously we've talked about how these biases are rampant in fantasy football drafts, waiver wire pickups, et cetera. You've named a lot, you've written about a lot in your book. Are there 3 top biases that you would highlight for our listeners to kind of hone in on and be aware of?
Sure. One other thing that I would add to the definition is that it's a process that we're not usually consciously aware of that might result in a lower quality decision. Yeah. So biases have been around since the beginning of evolutionary history, and it's important to remember that wouldn't be the case if they weren't helpful. Like in some situations in life, cognitive biases they have our back, or else we wouldn't still have them. So things like recency bias recency, primacy are really prevalent in sports, especially sports with shorter seasons and fewer games like football. But those are really useful in life, like paying attention to what happened yesterday is often a good predictor of what's happening today, weather-wise. Not where I live. Where I live in upstate New York, it was 28 yesterday and it was 58 today. So yesterday is a bad predictor of today. But, generally paying attention to what has happened in the recent past is beneficial for predicting the near future.
Right.
But in fantasy football, we can rely a little bit too much and give too much weight. It's really an issue of weighting the recent performance over the history of performances. So like a player that I'm thinking about a lot this week is Brashad Perriman, who had 2 touchdowns with Joe Flacco on Monday Night Football a couple weeks ago. So it's like so much in my head, like, wow, Joe Flacco really likes him. He totally came through in the clutch with these 2 big scores, but the rest of his season has, he's been a little hurt here and there and everything, but he's not a 2 touchdown a game player. We have to remember that.
Yeah.
To some extent. So I think recency is one that will get us. And again, it's not always a bad thing, right? If you were using recency bias with Chase Claypool earlier in the season when he had his first good game and you went out and got him and used him the next week, you had an even better game, right? So it worked out. Which brings me to another bias that sort of framed my whole, outside of the trade deadline series, sort of framed my whole series at The Athletic around outcome bias, which is judging our decisions by the outcome rather than the inherent quality at the time the decision was made. So, of course, how well the player plays on Sunday matters, but there are good decisions that come out badly for tons of reasons, right? A wide receiver who's going to catch a 90-yard touchdown, he's targeted on that play and he trips over his shoelace and falls. Doesn't mean it was a bad decision to play him because, what you thought might happen, happened. Same thing with injuries. weather, stuff happens that's totally out of our control. And it doesn't mean we should like never play that player again. And it goes the other way too. You can make a bad decision and have it surprisingly work out great, right? The defender trips over his shoelace and falls down, and your wide receiver 5 catches an 80-yard touchdown.
Right.
So we should be really careful about evaluating our decisions, and also assigning credit or blame. We tend to take credit for good decisions and blame other people for bad decisions. Like Jake Steele, our ranker at The Athletic, gets blamed for a lot of fantasy players' bad decisions.
He told me to do it.
They said.
Yeah.
About it. But, ultimately, it's you that's clicking the final submit lineup button every week. So you have to be able to justify your decisions. And if you can justify it on Thursday morning, you can justify it Monday night, right? It's either a good decision when you made it, or maybe you made it and you knew it wasn't a great decision, but you have to own up to it, I think.
I have a question. So recency bias, we've talked about recency bias on this pod. And Renee, I think you hit the nail on the head by saying like it is rampant. I see it a lot with a lot of betting lines as well. It's like, oh, one team did well last week, the other didn't. And therefore, like that's why I think, one team was favored. Outcome bias. So again, like if a guy, I guess was it the Brashad Perriman example where it's like you saw him do well on Monday night. He had a great outcome. Explain that one a little bit more, because I think that one's important, and I want to separate it from, let's say, like a recency bias.
Right. So it can intertwine. Of course, they can all intertwine, but outcome bias is really more like when you say, this happened to one of my friends in a league where he had like 90 points on his bench, and Sunday night he was saying, I knew I should have started X over Y.
Right.
Okay.
But if he knew that, he would have done it. So able to justify making the sit decisions that he made, and should say, wow, I really thought it was going to come out different. I misjudged. What did I misjudge? What about these outcomes was I wrong about? The player I thought was going to be better was not better, right?
Right.
Because there's 10 points in my starting lineup and 90 points on my bench.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
So what is it about the situation that I got wrong? Is a thoughtful way to look at that, not just I knew I should have done that. I should have believed the ESPN projection, whatever.
And I think the result, I'm guessing like the result of that often is like, you leave all those points on your bench and you kind of regret it. You're like, oh man, like DJ Chark put up like 20 points on my bench last week. I got to start him this week.
Yeah.
And to your point, it's like, if you actually did some analysis, it's like, well, he had a week, he's playing a weaker corner. And next week he's playing a better corner. So just because he did 20 in your bench doesn't mean you should start him the following week.
Right. But a careful analysis is necessary to figure that out. Was it just luck? Or, a lot of times what'll happen is somebody has a great game, but somebody else in the game got hurt.
Yeah.
That allowed that, whether it's a defender or another offensive player that would have taken some target share.
Right.
So it's really not just, outcome bias is judging strictly on the number that appears, at the end of the day. A more careful approach says, how did we get there?
Right. Yeah. And some of that, how did we get there is relatively predictable, right? Like they're playing a crappy versus a really good defense, or, this guy's been getting a lot of targets in the last 6 weeks. He's probably going to keep getting targets, say Jarvis Landry or something, right? They don't throw the ball a lot, but OBJ gets hurt. He's probably going to keep getting targets. But other aspects, as you said, are not so predictable. And so I think if you go back and do that careful analysis you're talking about, some of those predictable versus not predictable things reveal themselves, right? So if it's that somebody got hurt, what can you do, right? Like Nick Chubb got hurt, and so Kareem Hunt goes off. Like, can't predict that, right?
Right. And it helps. If you acknowledge that you're prone to some of these emotional reactions and you commit to taking the rational, logical approach to understanding it, the outcome, you can, I think, be a better player. It just makes you a more careful, well-informed, less reactive, instinctual, quote, player.
Yeah. We mentioned these biases, right? We mentioned, recency bias and outcome bias. And these are pitfalls that I think a lot of managers, trip over and create error from. And the corollary to that is like, well, how do we use this to our advantage? Number one, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, is like, try and be conscious of these things and look at the data and try and make as objective, and we're all inherently subjective, but try and make as objective decisions as possible. Are there any other biases that you can use either against your opponent, or is there anything else that you could be aware of to help rather than to hurt? I mean, one I think is be aware of it, but is there anything else that we can use it in the positive sense?
I mean, I just think being aware of so many of these tendencies is key. Another one that you might be able to take advantage of, I don't know if the taking advantage of person would think it was positive, but another idea called the pseudocertainty effect that I like. It's the idea that when things are going well, you should not make any changes, like you should roll with it. And we have all these sayings that I think stem from the kernel of the pseudocertainty effect, like don't rock the boat or let sleeping dogs lie, those kind of things. And then when things are not going well, you should really blow it up and make drastic moves, putting all your cards on the table. Those, things, we have all these sayings that allude to the pseudocertainty effect. And some people are not able to do that. I think I get so many comments on my athletic articles saying like, I'm in first place by a mile and I have all these great players. Should I trade them away? Should I no, you shouldn't. No. Clearly no. And I'm jealous. But they just can't sit still. It's like boring to be drafted an injury-proof winning fantasy team is boring. I feel like you're not really playing when it's just so easy. So people are prone to making moves when they don't need to. So I think that's something you could take advantage of. If you have a coasting team, you could see like, how bored are they? Do they really have they worked for it, or do they just sit back?
Interesting. Right? Yeah, no, I'm 10-0 in one of my leagues, and nobody's targeted me for that yet. But here's the thing. But the thing, like, I've been playing fantasy football since like 1999 or something, right? So like, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, because too many times I've been 9-1, 10-0, whatever, and just steamrolling to the playoffs, and then I get crushed in the first round, right? So I'm just waiting for something bad to happen at this point, even though I'm 4 games up on the rest of the league or whatever. It's like, all right, well, something shitty's gonna happen. Here it comes.
So you could try to preempt it by like getting rid of one of your really good players, right?
I'm just gonna trade Patrick Mahomes. Like, they can have him. Whatever. I've had enough of the guy. I don't need him anymore.
So that's maybe next level game theory, kind of using people's biases against them.
I like that, using people's biases against them.
Yep.
All right, so we have sort of a random question that we both have been spending some time thinking about, and we've noticed this effect happening. And I don't know if there's a bias for it. I don't know if you have an explanation, but basically, sometimes you'll see a player on the waiver wire. You're like, man, I need to get that guy. Let's say it's Jameis Winston this week, right? If you're looking for a QB, he's probably going to be decently productive. Maybe he'll throw 600 picks, but he'll probably have some TDs too, right? So you really want to get Jameis. You go for him. You don't get him on the waiver wire because you're too low in priority or whatever. Another team gets him. You still really want him and need him, but you find yourself not wanting to, or not being willing to propose a trade to try to get him. And you feel that way maybe because you're like, man, I could have had him for free or whatever nominal transaction fee I have. What's going on there? Like, why do you decide it's not worth going after him when you barely missed him?
Yeah. I was thinking actually about shopping when you were talking. It's the same thing with clothes. Like, if something is on sale and you're like, oh, I really want it, I should get it, it's on sale. And for whatever reason, the sale ends before you buy it. You still want it. It still would look great. You still have the occasion to wear it. And now you don't want to pay full price. It's very similar. So I think you're on to something. I think there probably is some real bias there. You know, a lot of biases have to do with our imagination too. Like, we imagine the scenario as if it were reality.
Yeah.
So in some sense, you already owned them for free, right? You're imagining. We always try to, most people I think tend to imagine more positively. I assume there are some pessimists out there that are like, I'm putting this claim in, but there's no way I'm ever going to get him, right? I don't think that. I always imagine everything's going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
So when it doesn't, you already, there's almost some bitterness there, I think, some resentment. And we also kind of have this tendency to, which is good, to adjust very quickly to the reality. So when you don't get Jameis Winston, you don't want to feel bad about it for too long. So you can maybe even start talking yourself into all those picks and, he's probably going to be worse than I thought. And I probably don't really need it that bad anyway. And so if you're trying to console yourself over, not getting that player and you're going to think about all his bad qualities, that's going to make you less willing to trade something fair too.
Right. There's some cognitive dissonance involved where you attitudinally want the guy, but behaviorally you're not able to get him. And those two things don't align with each other, right? So you have to find some way to bring those two things into line with each other, which is to convince yourself, like you said, he's going to throw a million picks. I don't really need him.
Yeah.
Well, all cognitive biases, I mean, really, one of the great reasons that we have them is to protect our egos.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel bad about ourselves, but we use our brain's shortcuts to try to come up with excuses. That's why we might have read the rankings and used the player that was ranked 8 spots higher based on the rankings. But if that player does well on Sunday, we're like, God, it was so smart of me to start him.
Yeah.
So a lot of what goes on in our head is aimed at protecting our own self-image.
Yeah. And isn't that fantasy glory anyway, is just sitting atop the mountain going, I am so smart. This was all me.
I'm still bragging about RG3 winning me a title in 2012 or whatever that was before he destroyed himself. Yeah. Like I'm still bragging about it, even though it was obviously I had nothing to do with it, right? I just happened to have him and he went off for 3 games. It's like, okay, sweet, I'll take it.
This was so cool. This was so enlightening. This was so informative. I'm sure that everyone who listened and or watched to this is at least going to win all their trades, if not make the playoffs, if not win their leagues. If they want to learn a little bit more, you have written a book on this, which is awesome. Cognitive Bias in Fantasy Sports: Is Your Brain Sabotaging Your Team? I believe it's on Amazon. I think we've looked it up and for purchase on Amazon.
And there's a link in my Twitter bio too. It's at Renee Miller 01.
Very cool. Okay. Right. You're writing for The Athletic as well. Please contact Renee if you have questions. Contact us, and don't forget to rate and subscribe the show where applicable. We are on Twitter at HeadGamePsych. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Brett Levine, and you can find that guy on Twitter at BD Rosenberg PhD. And thanks as always for tuning in.